What if the reason they walked away so quietly was not because they stopped caring, but because they finally understood everything too clearly to stay the same? Because when an empath breaks, it never looks like breaking. It looks like silence, distance, and the calmness that most people completely misunderstand. Have you ever met someone who was always understanding, always patient, always giving chances, and then suddenly became someone you could not emotionally reach anymore? That shift is not random. It is the result of emotional awareness reaching its limit. And when that limit is crossed, something inside them reorganizes permanently. Today, we are going to understand why that happens and why it changes the way they love, trust, and disconnect forever.
Pause. What most people misunderstand about an empath is that their breaking point is never sudden. It is not a loud explosion or a single moment where everything falls apart at once. Instead, it is a slow and almost invisible buildup that happens over time. Layer by layer, experience by experience, emotional weight collects quietly beneath the surface. An empath does not react in the way most people expect. When they are hurt, they do not rush to fight back. They pause. They think. They try to understand what is happening instead of reacting emotionally. This is why from the outside they often look calm, even when something inside them is not. But inside they are constantly processing more than they show, and that silent processing becomes heavier with time. When an empath is disrespected, they do not immediately assume the worst. They search for meaning behind it. Maybe the other person is stressed, maybe they are having a difficult time, maybe there is something they are not seeing yet. If someone becomes distant or emotionally cold, the empath does not respond with the same distance.
Instead, they often move closer, thinking their presence or understanding might help fix what is wrong. This is where the real pattern begins. What looks like patience from the outside is actually a constant internal effort to maintain balance. They are always trying to align what they feel with what they believe others deserve, even if it means ignoring their own emotional discomfort. Over time, this creates a silent but dangerous habit. The empath starts accepting behavior that should have been questioned early on. Every time a boundary is crossed and nothing is said, something changes within them. It is not loud or obvious, but it is permanent. They feel the impact, they notice it deeply, but instead of expressing it, they store it inside. They tell themselves that reacting will create unnecessary conflict. They convince themselves that understanding the situation is more important than defending their own feelings.
Pause, so they stay quiet and continue absorbing more than they should. This is the part that most people never truly see. Empaths do not always show their pain in clear ways. They do not constantly talk about what hurt them or list every moment that disappointed them. But internally, nothing is ever fully erased. Everything is recorded in their emotional memory. Every inconsistency in behavior, every moment where they felt overlooked, and every situation where their effort was not matched stays inside them. It builds up silently, even when they appear completely fine on the surface. That is what makes their experience so difficult to notice from the outside. At this stage, it becomes important to understand the difference between endurance and tolerance. Endurance is a conscious choice. It has awareness and limits, and a person knows when they are choosing to continue. Tolerance, when stretched too far, becomes something else entirely. It turns into self-abandonment without the person realizing it.
The empath slowly moves into this state without noticing the shift. They are no longer staying because the situation is healthy or balanced. They're staying because leaving feels too heavy emotionally, especially after everything they have already invested. So they begin to give more. They explain more clearly. They become more patient than before. They try harder to fix issues that were never fully their responsibility in the first place. In doing so, They unintentionally teach the other person something important. They show that access to them has no real consequence, that forgiveness will always be available, that they will continue to stay no matter how uneven things become. Without saying a word, they create a pattern where their own boundaries slowly disappear. As this continues, the imbalance grows stronger. While the empath increases their effort, the other person often begins to decrease theirs.
Not always out of cruelty or intention, but because human behavior naturally adjusts to what it is allowed to become. When there are no boundaries, no resistance, and no emotional consequence, effort is not maintained. It weakens over time. The relationship becomes one-sided without anyone openly deciding for it to happen. It simply evolves that way. Still, the empath remains, not because they lack strength, but because their way of connecting is deep and serious. They do not attach casually. When they care about someone, they do it fully, with emotional depth and long-term commitment. For them, leaving does not feel like a simple decision. It feels like giving up on something meaningful that still has value. That is why they stay longer than they should, hoping that understanding or time will restore balance. But there is a hidden paradox in all of this. The more they ignore their own emotional signals, the stronger those signals become.
What starts as mild discomfort slowly grows into emotional exhaustion. What once felt like patience begins to feel like inner fatigue. And what was once hope gradually shifts into something sharper and more painful: clarity. Because at some point, they can no longer ignore the pattern they are living in. This realization does not come from one dramatic moment. It comes from repetition, from seeing the same behavior again and again in different situations. Slowly, the empath begins to understand that it was never just a misunderstanding or a temporary phase. It was a consistent pattern all along. And when that truth finally settles in, everything they were holding inside does not vanish. Instead, it organizes itself. It becomes clear all at once, like a picture finally coming into focus after being blurred for a long time. This is why their breaking point often looks sudden to others. People around them only see the present moment.
They see the silence, the distance, or the withdrawal and assume it came out of nowhere. But the empath has been carrying the entire history of the situation within them. Every ignored boundary, every emotional disappointment, every unbalanced moment has already been processed internally long before anything becomes visible on the outside. So when they finally step back, when they stop explaining, when they go quiet, it is not a sudden reaction. It is the result of a long internal process that has already reached its conclusion. The decision has already been made inside them before it ever becomes visible in their behavior. What others see as a breaking point is actually the final stage of acceptance. An empath does not truly break at the moment they are hurt. They break at the moment they understand that the hurt is not going to stop. That realization changes everything for them, because once they see the pattern clearly, they cannot unsee it.
And once they cannot unsee it, they can no longer return to the way things were before. Something inside them shifts permanently, not in anger, but in understanding. There is also a deeper moment in this journey that does not appear dramatic at all, but it quietly changes everything. It does not happen during conflict or emotional intensity. It happens in ordinary silence, in a normal situation, when something inside them finally aligns in a way that cannot be undone. It is not that they become someone different overnight. It is that they stop misreading what has been in front of them for a long time. Until this moment, the empath often holds on to the belief that people are generally good, that effort will eventually be returned, and that clear communication can fix most problems. This belief is not weakness. It is part of how they are built. They do not easily see people as disposable, and they do not quickly give up on connection.
They try to understand, to explain, and to repair, often believing that things will improve if enough care is given. They don't want to reduce relationships to transactions, so they give meaning to behavior that objectively does not deserve it. They reinterpret inconsistency as complexity. They label emotional neglect as stress. They frame distance as something temporary rather than something meaningful. In doing this, they delay a truth that their nervous system has already been registering for a long time. The body notices what the mind keeps explaining away, but the human mind has a limit for contradiction. You can only hold so many opposing interpretations before something inside you starts pushing for resolution. And for the empath, that resolution does not arrive through confrontation or argument. It arrives through perception, through a quiet internal shift in how things are seen rather than how they are discussed.
There comes a point where the empath stops asking, "Why is this happening?" and starts asking, "Why am I still explaining this to myself?" That question marks the beginning of a deeper awareness. Because once an empath starts observing without constantly justifying, the emotional fog begins to clear. What once felt confusing starts to feel structured. Patterns that were softened by hope begin to look sharper and more consistent. The inconsistency is no longer random in their mind. The imbalance in effort is no longer occasional. It becomes repeated and recognizable. Emotional confusion, which once felt like complexity, slowly begins to resemble design, a pattern that was always there but previously softened by their interpretation. This is where the internal fracture begins, not between the empath and other people, but between perception and reality. They start to recognize that they were not simply part of a relationship. They were actively maintaining it.
They were filling in emotional gaps that were never theirs to fill. They were compensating for absences that someone else consistently left unaddressed. And the most uncomfortable realization is not just that they were hurt, but that they were continuously placed in a position where they were needed more than they were valued. This is where clarity begins to form, but it does not feel comfortable at first. It feels disorienting because clarity removes the emotional cushioning that made endurance possible in the first place. Clarity takes away the stories that allowed them to stay. It removes the belief that things will improve if they simply try harder or communicate better. And when those internal narratives fall away, what remains is something very raw. It is truth without emotional protection. That is why this stage often feels like distance before it feels like strength. The empath begins to withdraw internally long before anything changes externally.
Conversations that once felt meaningful begin to feel repetitive. Emotional effort that once felt purposeful begins to feel one-sided. The urgency they used to feel slowly disappears, not because they no longer care, but because their perception is changing. What is actually happening is not detachment from others, but reconnection with their own internal clarity. For the first time, they are no longer responding to potential or hope. They are responding to reality. And reality carries a different emotional weight. It does not bend easily to intention or optimism. It simply exists as it is. Alongside this shift, something else becomes noticeable. The empath stops investing energy into being understood by people who have consistently shown they are not willing to understand. This is not bitterness or emotional withdrawal in a negative sense. It is a form of internal efficiency. They stop spending energy on explanations that lead nowhere.
The need to be validated by the same source that created confusion begins to dissolve. This is the stage where the empath becomes dangerous in a psychological sense, not because they harm others, but because they stop maintaining the emotional imbalance that once held the dynamic together. When someone stops over-explaining, over-giving, and over-adjusting, the entire structure of the relationship changes. The system loses its emotional compensation. And that is when people start noticing something different, even if they cannot fully define it. The empath is still present, but something essential has shifted. The emotional availability is no longer automatic. What others interpret as distance is actually alignment, because for the first time, the empath is not reacting from fear of loss or fear of misunderstanding. They are responding from recognition of truth. And once that recognition becomes stable, the need to argue disappears, the need to convince fades.
The need to repair what was never equally built begins to lose meaning. They simply see things as they are. And in that clarity, the illusion that kept them emotionally invested begins to dissolve. The awakening of an empath is not the moment they stop caring. It is the moment they finally understand what they were carrying all along and realize they no longer need to carry it in the same way. When that understanding becomes permanent, the old version of them does not return, because what has changed is not just behavior, but perception itself. And once perception shifts at that level, reversal is no longer natural. When an empath detaches, most people misinterpret it. They assume emotional coldness, withdrawal, or a loss of sensitivity. But what is actually happening is not emotional shutdown. It is emotional reorganization. The empath does not lose their ability to feel. They lose the automatic pattern of overengaging with emotional inconsistency.
For a long time, they operate in a highly receptive emotional state. They notice tone, energy, silence, and meaning beneath words. That depth allows connection, but it also creates imbalance when it is not returned. When emotional openness is repeatedly placed in a one-sided dynamic, the internal system begins to compensate. The empath starts filling communication gaps, anticipating emotional needs that are never spoken, and stabilizing emotional fluctuations that are not theirs to regulate. Over time, this becomes exhausting in a way that is not immediately visible. What looks like care from the outside is actually sustained emotional labor happening internally without recognition or reciprocity. So when the limit is reached, the shift is not dramatic, it is not reactive or chaotic, it is quiet. Structured silence replaces constant explanation. It is a silence that comes from a mind that has already processed more than it is willing to continue expressing.
This is where confusion often begins for others, because they were used to an empath who clarified, who softened tension, who repaired misunderstandings quickly. That version of the empath was actively engaged in emotional maintenance. But once detachment begins, that system goes offline. This does not mean empathy disappears. It means empathy is no longer given without structure. Emotional detachment in an empath is not absence of feeling. It is the removal of automatic emotional access. It is a shift from immediate emotional reaction to measured evaluation. Instead of absorbing every inconsistency in real time, they begin to observe it from a distance. And that shift creates something very noticeable: calmness. But this calmness is not emotional peace in the traditional sense. It is clarity. They are no longer internally negotiating every interaction. They are no longer converting confusion into patience.
They are no longer absorbing instability and trying to stabilize it within themselves. That internal work stops, and when it stops, their external behavior changes. They speak less, but with more intention. They no longer rush to fill silence. They no longer over-explain boundaries. They no longer feel responsible for repairing emotional discomfort that does not belong to them. To those who depended on their emotional engagement, this feels like loss. But from the empath's perspective, it feels like restoration, because their emotional energy is no longer being consumed in real time by managing other people's emotional states. It is redirected inward into awareness, observation, and self-regulation without external interference.
They stop turning potential into justification. And once that stops, any relationship built on emotional overfunctioning begins to destabilize naturally. That destabilization is what others feel as distance. But nothing essential has been removed. What has changed is that the empath is no longer compensating for emotional gaps that were never theirs to carry. And in that shift, something rare emerges. Not control, not dominance, but restraint. And restraint, especially in emotionally charged environments, is a form of strength that most people only recognize once it is already in place. They react, they pursue, they explain, and they attempt to fix what feels unbalanced. The empath, in contrast, learns something very different over time. They learn to observe without rushing into immediate response. And in that small but powerful delay between what happens and how they respond, something important begins to develop.
Curious. That space becomes the place where awareness replaces impulse. In that space, they regain something they did not fully have before: choice. Choice over whether to engage or not. Choice over whether to explain or stay silent. Choice over where to place emotional investment. And most importantly, choice over who gets access to their inner world.
And when emotional response becomes a choice rather than a reflex, the entire psychological dynamic changes. Emotional access is no longer assumed or automatic. It becomes something that has to be earned through consistency, respect, and mutual effort. What once appeared as emotional distance is actually emotional precision. And once an empath reaches this stage, something fundamental shifts within them. They are no longer guided by the fear of losing people. Instead, they are guided by awareness of what it has cost them to keep the wrong dynamics alive for too long. In that realization, silence changes meaning completely. It is no longer a reaction to pain or confusion. It becomes a conscious decision. And that decision quietly dissolves relationships that were built on emotional imbalance, without arguments, without confrontation, and without the need to explain anything that has already been understood internally.
Many people think of boundaries as something created in frustration, like a reaction after being hurt. But for the empath, boundaries become something more advanced. They are not reactions to harm anymore. They become systems designed to prevent repeated harm from happening in the first place. This is a major psychological shift. Before this stage, the empath operates in a relational pattern based on adaptation.
They adjust themselves constantly. They accommodate others. They interpret behavior generously. They soften tension. They try to maintain connection even when it is uneven. But after enough cycles of emotional imbalance, something changes internally. They stop negotiating and start filtering. Filtering is very different from adapting. Adapting asks, how do I make this work? Filtering asks, does this even deserve access to me? That one question changes the entire direction of their emotional life. Because now, not every interaction is treated as something they must emotionally enter. Instead, it is evaluated with clarity, not through judgment or negativity, but through recognition of patterns. They begin to notice inconsistency earlier. They stop trying to resolve behavior that is clearly repetitive. They step away before emotional investment becomes deeper and harder to untangle.
At this stage, self-respect stops being an idea and becomes visible through behavior.
The empath is no longer balancing relationships that were never truly balanced to begin with. The empath is no longer emotionally available to dynamics that disrupt that order. And this is not punishment, it is preservation. Emotional intelligence at this stage matures into emotional authority. Not authority over others, but authority over self. They no longer need to announce boundaries repeatedly because their behavior already reflects them. They no longer need to explain their limits because those limits are already visible in their decisions. And they no longer seek validation for the choices because those choices are internally aligned. That alignment creates something rare: emotional consistency. There's no longer constant conflict between what they feel and what they tolerate. No more disconnect between intuition and behavior. No more self-abandonment in order to maintain connection.
From the outside, this looks like a transformation into a stronger version of themselves. But from the inside, it feels more like a return to self that was never fully protected before. So when people say an empath was broken, they misunderstand what actually happened. Breaking was never the final state. It was only the transition. What came after was not damage. It was definition, a clearer understanding of who they are, what they allow, and what they will never repeat again. And once that clarity becomes permanent, the empath does not return to the version of themselves that confused endurance with love, because they now understand something irreversible. Not everyone deserves access to their depth. And once that truth becomes part of who they are, the way they move through life changes permanently. Not louder, not colder, but unmistakably wiser. In the end, the journey of an empath is not about becoming distant or disconnected. It is about finally understanding the difference between feeling deeply and carrying too much.
For a long time, they confused patience with self-sacrifice, understanding with silence, and loyalty with overextension. They stay longer than they should, explain more than they need to, and give more than is returned, not because they lack awareness, but because they see potential where others only show inconsistency. But with time, experience becomes clarity, and clarity changes everything. They begin to see patterns without emotional distortion. They begin to recognize what is mutual and what is one-sided. And slowly, they stop trying to fix what was never balanced to begin with. This is not coldness. It is awareness. It is the moment they choose peace over confusion and self-respect over emotional exhaustion. And once that shift happens, they no longer live in reaction to others. They live in alignment with themselves. They do not lose their depth, they protect it. They do not stop caring, they stop over-carrying.
And in that quiet transformation, they finally understand that real strength was never about how much they could endure, but about knowing when to stop.